for every available vote.
Order. I call the member for Dawson.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I rise to speak on this matter of public importance. That the impact of the record numbers of people illegally entering Australia by boat under this government. Now, no other issue today that faces the Australian people better illustrates the outcomes of a chaotic, divided and dysfunctional government. What better manifestation of an incompetent government could there actually be than the deliberate removal of policy walls that were protecting our home, our nation, just as we've seen under this Labor, Rudd and Gillard governments. Perhaps tonight's budget might actually be a better manifestation, but let's not actually forget the impact that losing control of our borders is actually going to have on tonight's budget and all the budgets. More than $5 billion of border protection blowouts have occurred since the last election, and that's contributed to the substantial black hole that the Treasurer will preside over tonight. The blowout results from Labor's remarkable ability to spot something that's solved, something that's fixed, to turn it into a problem and then quickly turn it into a crisis. Having watched the former Prime Minister John Howard effectively stop the flow of legal boat arrivals, this Labor government proceeded to dismantle the solution, create a problem, it's turned into a crisis, and the boats keep coming and coming and coming. Since November 2007, when the successful Howard government ended, we've seen a staggering 40,772 illegal arrivals in our country. The sheer scale of Labor's border protection failure now surpasses the population of most towns in my electorate of Dawson. The Labor Party must be wishing that those illegal arrivals could all vote, because they must have almost imported half an electorate in the past 5.5 years. But I've got to tell you, the other 150 real electorates around the nation are not so impressed. People have genuine concerns about their country throwing its doors open to economic refugees, throwing the immigration program over to people smugglers, human traffickers and perhaps terrorists. In this post-9/11 world, we see airport security getting tighter and tighter, but in the post-Howard years we see Australia's maritime border security getting looser and looser. When this government sets new benchmarks for porous borders on a daily basis, Australians rightly question how many illegal arrivals are genuine refugees who will become tomorrow's citizens, and how many are using the back door to become a threat to our nation. Now, illegal immigration through people smuggling is a threat to all Australians. It is a threat because it raises serious security and criminal concerns, it raises quarantine and health issues, it costs time and money in processing, and a lot of time and a lot of money under this government, and most importantly, because it infringes on our nation's sovereignty and gives us less control over who comes into this country. Now, these are not actually my claims. What I've paraphrased there is from the Australian Federal Police website. The Australian Federal Police website. And to quote, to rebut what was said by the previous speaker, the member for Moreton, arrival in illegal people smuggling vessels is actually different and more of an issue than illegal arrival by plane, because we actually know who you are when you get here by plane. You have to have identification to get on the plane. We probably know where you're from as well. When you arrive by boat without identification, there's a serious issue in terms of working out whether you're a security risk for this nation. And so while those on the opposite side would have us believe that all of these concerns are just unfounded, the facts actually speak for themselves. Last week, May the 7th, on 9 News, it was reported that 4 Vietnamese asylum seekers, including a teenage boy, were on the run after escaping from the Darwin Detention Centre. What about the public revelation in April that recent unauthorised arrivals included a Sri Lankan man who allegedly fled his home after allegedly killing his girlfriend, an Egyptian man who was the subject of a high-level Interpol red notice for terrorism activities, an Iranian man accused of drug trafficking in Tehran. Now, a month ago, I noticed a report that asylum seekers who had actually been branded as national security threats were protesting and asking the government to release them from detention or kill them. Now, the article that I read about this went on to say that most of the asylum seekers have been in detention for 2 or 3 years following adverse security assessments from ASIO. They're among 56 in Australia that have been deemed threats to national security without the ability to challenge those decisions. But they have been deemed by our agency that looks after national security as national threats, national security threats. Now, September 4 last year in The Australian, there was a report that asylum seekers with violent histories are being released on bridging visas or into community detention, and one was even allowed to marry in detention and make home visits to his wife. The 31-year-old was considered by ASIO to be a risk to security. Again last year, August 16, The Australian reported asylum seekers travelling to Australia have been identified by Sri Lankan authorities as members of the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam. The identification of the terrorist group members were based on photographs of new arrivals published in the Australian media. Back in 2010, July 14, The Australian reported Indonesian authorities believe they've captured a senior Afghan al-Qaeda-linked figure posing as an asylum seeker trying to reach Australia. There is this overwhelming body of evidence that Labor's open doors policy is a real direct threat to our national security and our way of life. We can look to the experience in Britain to actually see the impact of unfettered illegal immigration. And in an op-ed piece back in 2009, the foreign editor of The Australian, Greg Sheridan, actually wrote about a discussion that he'd had with the then British Foreign Secretary David Miliband. And Miliband said to him that 75% of all terrorist plots that were aimed at Britain actually originated in the federally administered tribal areas of Pakistan. And he noted that some 800,000 Pakistanis live in Britain. And he said, and I quote, that the vast majority of those Pakistanis, it goes without saying, are law-abiding citizens, but there is a link between uncontrolled Muslim immigration and terrorism. The real historic significance of the illegal immigration crisis in our northern waters is that this could, if things go wrong, be the moment Australia loses control of our immigration program, and that would be a disaster." End quote. If we are importing potential security risks because we're too scared to be labelled a racist or a bigot or we're dog whistling or whatever, then we're condemning this nation to an inevitable terrorist attack. The real danger that we face is that most Australians are too scared to mention the elephant in the room, and this Labor government is too gutless to acknowledge that the elephant that they rolled out the red carpet for is a very dangerous thing to actually have in your room. You know, never one to wear the gutless tag. The former member for Connor Wilson-Tuckey in 2009 said he believed terrorists could be masquerading as asylum seekers. And his reasoning was this: if you want to get in Australia and have bad intentions, what do? He said you insert yourself into a crowd of 100 for which there's great sympathy for. The other 99, you go on a system where nobody brings their papers, you have no identity and you have no address. And at the time, the member for Griffith, then Prime Minister, predictably condemned those comments. But the fact is that Wilson-Tuckey was right. Wilson-Tuckey was right. And the facts speak for themselves. The Gillard Labor government, not content with having the worst border security crisis in the history of our nation because of their dismantling of policies that worked, they are now trying to pull the rug out from our national security agencies. These are the agencies charged with the responsibility of ensuring those who arrive illegally on our shores do not pose a risk to this nation. And this is what the Labor Party wants them to do. Now, 2 weeks ago, May the 1st, Radio National reported that Labor backbenchers were pressuring the government on ASIO assessments. They said the federal government says it's considering calls by its own backbench for increased scrutiny of the way ASIO makes adverse assessments of asylum seekers. They are upset because those 55 alleged asylum seekers that I spoke of before have no prospect of release in sight because they are deemed by a national security agency to be a threat to this nation. So, far from recognising the dangers of security threats to this country, the Labor Party wants to ignore what ASIO says and just let them in. Well, we ignore the advice of ASIO at our peril. Now, I'm reminded of a story which was printed in The Australian on the 4th of September 2001, a week before the terrorist attacks in the World Trade Center, and it reported the US Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs, James Kelly, who said the flow of illegal immigrants from South Asia and the Middle East into Indonesia is a source of concern. He said, and I quote, "If it's easy to move people under strange identities around And that's a capability that terrorists who we know exists can actually use.
Thank you.
Labor has removed our border controls. They have put this nation at risk. A nation without borders is like a house without